Thanks very much, Iris. So I'm actually a marine biologist, but I'm also an environmental scientist. So what I'll be talking to you about today is a workshop that I facilitated for CN Rail, Canadian National Railway. And the reason why I believe that Iris asked me to come to speak is we thought that by giving some case studies and examples from another industry, you could sort of see how the culture might be different from your culture, or the challenges I had might be slightly different, but there might be some messages and things that you might be able to take from that. So I'm going to go through an exercise of demonstrating how we kind of examined some institutional challenges and what our approach was to overcome that. So what we did was we brought a team together, and the champion for this was the two heads of environment and biology at CN Rail, Stella Carness and Luann Patterson. And I'd been talking to them for a number of years about trying to not be so reactive in what they're doing, to be more proactive, to find a corporate strategy that you could use to really think about habitat and how that could increase the value of their land. Now, in the railways, what do railways do? They move cargo. And so if you're at the top of the railway, you're only concerned about moving cargo. So when do you start thinking about habitat? You think about habitat when you have a spill and you have to clean it up. You think about habitat when you have to do a bridge replacement and you're going to damage habitat and you have to compensate for it. So all of these things are very reactive. And with the enormous land capacity that the railways have, very similar to what a utility would have. You have 150 years of having these national crossways across the country. It's an enormous legacy and an enormous risk, potentially. So if you ignore properly managing your lands, you could potentially be costing yourself a lot of money. So the purpose of the workshop was to get people thinking in a different way and thinking about what the value of their land might be and how you could use habitat as a way of beneficial reuse. And we're going to talk, sort of give you some broad examples about how we were looking from the railway perspective at habitat. And in some cases, these are very pollinator specific. In other ones, there's another species or another kind of habitat you're developing, but there's often opportunities for pollinators within that. So sometimes you have to kind of choose your battles and see what the bigger pictures are. So there were three sort of main property types that the railways were concerned about, where they were actually thinking about habitat. So contaminated sites, you had a spill, now you got to clean it up. Marginal operational lands, which would include right-of-ways, and any sort of parcels of lands attached to yards and various things like that. And then surplus properties that the railway was given 150 years ago, and they're not quite sure what to do with them. And then when we were talking about value, we wanted the group that we brought together to not just think about the direct benefits, so the financial benefits. In addition to that, you're thinking about your liability, how you can reduce your risk, but also if you have a project that you're moving forward with, if you have habitat that you've already banked, you have much higher certainty in being able to go through the regulatory process. So all of those have a dollar value assigned to that. But in addition to that, there are huge environmental cradle-to-grave issues that can be very beneficial. Corporate social responsibility. You have to understand that in Canada, for many Aboriginal communities, the last time people saw their children before they went to residential school was on a train. So they said goodbye to their kids on CN Rail, and some of these schools, mortality rates were as high as 30 to 60% over 5 years. So when you have an institution that has that association in their history, you have a long way to come with First Nations communities. And they go through hundreds and hundreds of First Nation communities in the Canadian North and across the country. And so we're looking at ways that you can use habitat as a mechanism to not only increase the brand, but your community engagement, as well as the health and wellness of your staff, to have a nicer environment. So what we did is we had a morning session in which we looked at different case studies, both ones that different individuals at CN had been involved in, and they were basically sort of one-offs. Different people would champion different projects, but nothing was done systemically. And also some case studies that looked at different applications that we thought they could apply to the railroads. And I'll give you a few examples of those. And then in the afternoon, it was all a working session. We wanted to try to identify what the challenges were, how we could overcome them, and what were our next steps going to be. So, and I forgot to mention earlier, I think I skipped every one of the slides. No, it didn't come up here. It must have gotten hidden. We had a group that came from environment, from contaminated sites, from biology, from real estate, from Aboriginal engagement, and from public affairs. So these people deal with each other on a project-by-project basis. Some of them had worked for the company for over 30 years, and they'd never actually been in the room together. So just that exercise is really valuable for the team, just to get to know each other. And the goal of the workshop was to get people to know each other, and when they're thinking about increasing the value of their land and beneficial reuse, to know who to call and to let people be thinking sort of on the same way. So we had some typical projects that are very familiar to what's being described today on right-of-ways, planting wildflowers, access for beekeepers, monarch butterflies. And one of the big drivers for these railway lots is that there'll be a call from the mayor's office to say, clean up your yard. They look really yucky. There's weeds all over it. And so a lot of the work is actually complaint-driven, either from the public or from government. And so these are non-actively managed lands. There's a lot of risks associated with that. So there's a lot of opportunities to take advantage of that with pollinator habitat. Now, the other side we have is there's also been opportunistic studies or opportunistic events that have happened where there's been complaints about your yard looks really ugly, so the manager will go and actually plant trees to have a nice screen. And there's been a few cases where these very kind of cement landscapes, the workers will actually go and actually plant raised bed gardens. So there have been a few different concepts and projects the CN has taken on, but again, they weren't systemic. They were just sort of one person was a champion and they took that independently. So one of the things we brought to CN to think about is the idea of a brownfield urban gardening situation. So some of their lands go through cities. And one of the challenges is that a lot of these urban railway right-of-ways and lands are actually being redeveloped, but they're contaminated. And so there is an opportunity, if you have contaminated land, there's an opportunity to redevelop that. But if you're redeveloping it towards residential, you then have to pay residential property taxes. So you have an opportunity actually to take that land, transform it into temporary agricultural land by putting raised beds on it, and you can actually decrease your property taxes in the interim before you develop it. And so there's a program in Vancouver in which we've been involved in developing this, putting orchards in place, putting vegetable gardens in place, and we actually employ individuals from the downtown east side to get training. This is an inner city community that is marginalized, and so it provides training and employment for these individuals. And so it's been a really, really good social enterprise. And so this is one thing that they're quite interested in, because you're getting the social benefit, and then you're also getting the habitat and the agricultural benefit and the pollinator benefit. The other thing we looked at was ways that you could bring the environment or bring habitat actually onto CN lands where it would actually benefit operations. So we had a case where this is one particular champion who's in Western Canada, one of the spill response guys, but he has a real interest in trying to really benefit habitat in the environment. So he saw this problem in that the electric utility had a tower, and there was an osprey nest on that tower, and the tower went down, and the osprey nest was destroyed. Now, the problem is the osprey will put a nest on the highest tree or the highest structure that's in the area. Well, the highest structure in the area was on the CN yard. So the next spot they knew that the osprey was going to put a nest on was actually going to disrupt activities on the railway. So proactively, he went and put an osprey nest platform away from the yard, and that was very successful. The ospreys went and colonized there, put a new nest on top of there. And then the second thing that he proactively did was he realized people were going to want to look at it. And the problem with railways is there's a lot of danger involved. So what he did is he put a viewing platform that attracted the public to that location, which was safe, rather than people crossing the rail line. So you have to think carefully about what people's behavior are and how you can modify that behavior so that it's in a safe manner. The other thing that they were involved in, the same fellow who is the champion for this, was that there was a big issue of health concerns around West Nile virus that was being transmitted by mosquitoes. So rather than using pesticides, why don't we choose organisms that eat mosquitoes? So what he did was he put up bat boxes. That's the image that you see on the left here, the rectangular box that's at the top of the side of that structure. And then these small ones on the other two pictures, they're all swallow boxes. So they've gone up in all of the yards in Western Canada, and then every year there's been about 16 new locations where they've put either bat boxes or swallow boxes up, and that's been really successful. Now, I'm going to throw in a couple other ones along the way just to get people's juices kind of thinking about when groups are thinking about habitat, you want to sort of think broadly. So one of the challenges we have now is about thinking about climate change adaptation and mitigation and how can we actually respond to that. So one of the big challenges is sea level rise. So we have a lot of railways that are going either along rivers or along the side of the ocean, and those rail beds are really vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surges. So if you can decrease the energy of the waves that are hitting the shore, you can decrease the statistical chance of getting flooding in those areas and getting infrastructure damage. So what we've been involved in is actually softening those shorelines by putting in vegetation along the shoreline, and then decreasing the wave energy by establishing artificial reefs subtidally and have kelp forests that are going through it. And in that way, you're able to increase that habitat and that benefit. We'll just skip over this one. This is another artificial reef and actually using recycled concrete rail ties in order to create complex habitat for rare species like reef fish. And we use this as a way to anchor the top of the contaminated site. So again, think really broadly about how you can use habitat as a multidisciplinary approach to get your corporate social responsibility, get your habitat in place, deal with your contaminated site, and get good branding and public image. And we also looked at habitat enhancement and banking opportunities as well. So one of the things that we discussed was how you could do partnerships. That's come up several times today. And the thought here is with these many lands that the railways have that are not actively managed, you could actually have a partnership in a remote area with the local community who could then take on management of that land in exchange for a small grant. So for example, set up a beekeepers club or set up a monarch habitat in that area. And so we've looked at that. So the afternoon session was on the working session, and what we did here was we first brainstormed and came up with a bunch of criteria. So how are we going to actually select sites? So you got a whole railway system, how are you going to select them? And these were our top 7 items to look at. So first of all, what kind of a site is it? Second of all, is there safety issues? With the railway, safety is a huge concern. 3, has the site been red flagged by the community? We already started getting calls from the mayor. Are there benefits to the community for the type of use that you're planning to do? Is it going to enhance the public profile of CN? And then what's your chance of getting success easily and quickly? And finally, what's that financial incentive for redevelopment? Because you got to sell that business case to upper management. So what we then did is we took these giant maps, and we put them on the wall, and we broke into different group sessions, and we brainstormed around how we could actually take these sites and what kind of things we could come up with. So just to give you sort of a flavor for it, for example, we had some situations, this one over here in the middle, you can see sort of a triangle there, that was a piece of property actually adjacent to First Nations land. So in that case, the solution we came up with was actually to give that land back to the First Nations so they could get access to hunting and fishing areas. We also looked at derailments at a farm site where there was metal contamination, and we did crop production in order to get phytoremediation to remove grow the crops, bioaccumulate the metals, and then remove and dispose of the contaminated plants. The next step we did is we determined that there was a series of tools and strategies we had to develop in order to move this forward. So one is we needed a national corporate strategy to deal with habitat enhancement. 2, we wanted to develop a tool to do site selection, so anyone would be able to screen these sites. So then you would have have it flagged to know that you wanted to do different opportunities on it. 3, to look at habitat banking. Where could you actually start banking those opportunities? Don't go into habitat enhancement without the chance of banking, because once you've started, if you haven't got the regulators on board, you've lost your opportunity to bank that. The community partnership we mentioned for non-actively managed lands. There are tax rebates for doing research and development. So collaborate with academic partners. Your whole program can be a 20 to 30% tax rebate. And then a database of success stories so that we could promote those both internally and externally. And so then the last step, which is what we're aiming for now, so we're still in the process, is that we wanted each participant to select their 5 favorite sites, rank them, and then we go into a workshop and we do a dragon's den. Everyone would have sort of a story for their site, sell them all. And then through that working session, we would choose one pilot site, figure out who the champion was going to be, figure out the budget, and then move forward to take that to fruition. So we're at the step now that we've identified what we need to do. Now we just need to do it. Thank you.